What we're going to do today is a rig rundown for the band I was in back in the 80s called Cheater. And what you're seeing right here is the core, the foundation of that sound. This bad boy and this bad boy were what started it all with that band for me. Before we talk about the gear, let's talk a little bit about the band. So when I joined Cheater, they found me actually, and they were looking for a guitar player. And I didn't want to be in a band at that point. It's a long story. But they talked me into coming over and jamming with them. And I thought, oh, you know, this is fun. I'm going to go ahead and hang out with these guys, play some shows with them. And one of the requirements was that I had to use the equipment they had. Now they had a manager. He wasn't really a professional music industry manager. He was just a good friend of the band who decided he was going to help these guys get ahead. And he told them that the gear that they were using was crap. Much to his credit, he went out and he bought them a crap load of gear. He bought a truck, he bought lights, he bought PA, and he bought 2 Ampeg V4 stacks for the guitar players. And because they belonged to the band, I was required to use it when I joined Cheater. Well, it didn't take me long to figure out that I did not like the sound of an Ampeg V4, so I went ahead and brought up the point that I had a Marshall stack. A genuine Marshall full stack. So once the guys found out that I had an actual Marshall stack, they decided that maybe it'd be okay if I used that. And the downside, of course, is that it's really loud. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. So long story short, I ended up joining the band. I talked them into bringing my former singer from my band Blackjack into the fold, and we started to get really popular really fast. We ended up booking 250 to 300 shows a year, every year, for quite a few years, and we were well known for our excellent sound. So the song that you heard at the beginning of this video was a tune I wrote for the band called Love Machine, and that recording is just a board tape, a live recording that we made at a show so that we could hear what mistakes we were making and what improvements we could make in the flow of the show and things like that. So as you can tell from that recording, I had a pretty ferocious guitar tone. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is how I got that tone. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, this guy and my amp were the very foundation of my sound. This particular guitar is a 1971 Gibson SG Deluxe. So when I joined Cheater, I only had 2 guitars. I had the SG Deluxe that I just showed you, and I had this guy. It's the 1969 SG Junior, they called it. So this guy was my main guitar. This is the one that I used whenever we were performing. I very rarely played this guy, primarily because this one had humbuckers and this one doesn't. This guy was my main guitar. You can see it here in an early promotional picture and some of these performance pictures from the early days. The SG Junior was my backup guitar, and I only used it if I broke a string on this one. So as time went on, I added more guitars to my arsenal. The very first one that I added was this guy. This is a 1977 RD Standard. Everybody knows RDs as having active pickups. This one's just a set of standard humbuckers, no active pickups. So interesting fact about this particular RD, it's only the 33rd one that Gibson ever made. Not long after I picked up the RD, I picked up this guy. This is a 1978 Gibson Flying V, obviously. This guitar's cool looks fast made it a fan favorite. Its looks, its excellent playability, and its awesome sound all combined to make this my most used guitar during the last couple of years of Cheater's existence. So the last guitar that I added to my arsenal while I was in Cheater is this guy. It's a 1978 Les Paul Deluxe, equipped with the mini humbuckers. Now while the Les Paul is a great guitar, it really didn't get any significant use while I was in Cheater. I alternated primarily between the SG Deluxe, the Flying V, and the RD. So those are the guitars that I was using. Now once the sound leaves your brain and your fingers and goes into your guitar, then the next thing is any pedals that you might have, and then it goes into the amp. Let's talk about the amp first. So this amp is a 1973 100 watt Super Lead. I bought it from its original owner who had never taken it out of his house. I could do a whole video on this amp, and maybe I will down the road, but for today I'm just going to give you the broad strokes. As you can see in some of the shots that follow, this amp has got some wear and tear on it, but overall it's in really good shape for an amp that toured all over for decades and is pushing 50 years old. Amp collectors talk about the Marshall Plexi as being the top of the food chain in terms of tone, and I'm not going to get into that debate because tone is subjective. My point is that in 1973 Marshall was still using the same Plexi circuitry and components in the Super Lead, but they had switched to this brushed aluminum faceplate rather than the plexiglass panel they were using previously, from which the term Plexi is derived. In the late 70s and early 80s, it was really common for guitar players to take their amps like this to custom shops and have them modded. They would have additional gain stages put in, they would have effects loops, they'd have master volumes put in. I never did any of that nonsense to this amp. It is stone stock. It's had a couple of repairs, but beyond that, it is stone stock. So the speaker cabinets are also completely stock. They've got the original Celestion speakers in them. Most of the time I'd only use one of the cabinets, unless we were in a really big venue. Then I might use both of them. But regardless of the size of the venue, 99% of the time we brought both cabinets in and set it up as a full stack. The reason for this was the visual impact. We had two V4 stacks on stage, we had a bass stack on stage and a Marshall stack, and at that point in time most bands at the level of Cheater were using smaller combo amps. And if an audience walked in and saw our humongous setup, they knew right away that Cheater was a different sort of beast. They knew they were in for a different show than what they were used to see. So as I mentioned, this amp is really loud, and that was a big problem in most of the venues that we played. Rather than modify my amp like a lot of the other guys were doing, I chose to use something called a power attenuator or a power soak. And this was a device that allowed me to run the amp head wide open, full throttle so to speak, and reduce the amount of power that actually got to the speakers. This was one of my tone secrets. There's something about running an amp wide open, pushing those tubes to their limit, that gives your amp a fat, sweet distortion sound. You can see the attenuator in these pictures on the top of my fender head, which we'll talk about a little bit later. This particular box is one that I had custom built by a local amp tech just for me. In later years I switched to this one, which was designed by Tom Schultz of the band Boston and manufactured by a company that he founded. Now that we've talked about the amp and the attenuator, let's talk about guitar pedals, distortion pedals in particular. This case you now see is the same case I used to transport all of my pedals and cables in the days of Cheater. It had a different stencil on it back then, but this is the exact same case. Today I have the entire collection of distortion pedals I used over the years with Cheater stored in this very case. No, your eyes are not deceiving you. I never used distortion pedals while I was in Cheater. True story. So how did I get that fat, perfectly saturated tone without using a distortion pedal? Well, three things basically. One was the power soak and running my amp wide open. That was the first thing. Second thing was this. This is an MXR Dynacomp. It's a compressor pedal. I would tape this to the stage next to my mic stand. Eventually it would go on a pedalboard, which was up by my mic stand, and I'd run my guitar into this guy. And you'll notice that the controls are taped on this thing. And that's because once I got a setting that I really liked, I didn't want these knobs to get moved accidentally. So I just taped them in place. And unlike tone controls, a compressor doesn't really depend on the environment that you're in. Once you set it and you get a tone you like, you can set it and forget it. And that's what I did with this guy. I ran the compression pretty high, but the volume was maxed out. And that would slam the front end of the amp and create even more gain and more distortion. But before it hit the front end of the amp, it went through this. This is an MXR 10-band graphic equalizer. Now we went from the compressor to the equalizer, and the equalizer has 12 dB of gain or attenuation, and this is actually pretty close to my normal setting on this. It might vary from room to room, venue to venue, but this is essentially the sort of curve you would see on this thing. You'll see those mids are boosted way high. I'm putting almost a full 12 dB of additional signal into the front end of the amp. So first we're slamming the EQ with this, and then we're slamming the front of the amp with that combined with this, and that would just really push it into super sweet distortion land, and it was awesome, as you can hear.
Can you take control? Can you feel its beat? Don't you just
There was another thing that was always in the signal path during the majority of my time with Cheater, and it was this. This is a Korg GT6 tuner. Now today it's really common for people to have tuners on stage on their pedal board. Back in the days of Cheater, really there weren't any pedal type tuners. If you wanted an electronic tuner, you had to get a strobe tuner, and those were really expensive and they were delicate and you didn't want to haul them around. But this guy came out and it seemed to be the perfect answer to what I needed. Now whether or not it affects the tone is debatable. I suppose we could run some tests and see, but I'm not going to do that. It might have affected the tone, it might not have affected the tone. Hard to say. It was always in the signal path. It was towards the end. It was either just before or just after the graphic equalizer. So it would have been next to last or the last thing in the signal path before the amp. So during my time with Cheater, I really only added a couple more effects pedals over the years. One of them was fairly important to our show. That was the Ibanez 8080. That was an analog delay pedal, an echo pedal. And that became pretty critical to our show because I would use that during my big guitar solo where it was just me on stage. I would use that sort of in the way Brian May used to delay in Brighton Rock, and then I would also do all kinds of crazy antics, turning the controls and the fog machine would be going. It was pretty cool. It was a lot of fun. I had a couple other ones that I used towards the end. I had I believe it was a DoD chorus pedal that I used, and I had an octave pedal that I used on some songs. Unfortunately, I've sold some of those because they weren't quite meeting my needs anymore, and at one point they became collectible, and I didn't want any more pedals stolen from me, so I decided to just sell them and use the money to buy something that was easily replaceable. So there was one other factor that affected my tone, and it was a total accident. What was that factor? Coily cables. I used coily cables rather than straight cables. So you're probably wondering how coily cables versus straight cables has anything to do with tone. Well, let's back up a little bit and talk about why I used coily cables. They're flexible. When I was using straight cables, the straight cables would get stepped on and they would either pull out of my guitar, even if it was wrapped around the strap button. Sometimes it would even pull the strap button out. Straight cables stuck out farther from my compressor and would get stepped on and would get broken. And the solution was to have a flexible cable that would have some give in it. Coily cable has give. The problem was they're not long enough. So my solution was to take two of these coily cables and connect them together using this little adapter. And that would give me a coily cord that was twice as long as anything else that was on the market. So that's why I used coily cables, was because of their practicality on stage. Still wondering what coily cables have to do with tone? If you look online, you'll see that a lot of people speculate part of Jimi Hendrix's great tone was due to the fact that he used coiled cables. So the coiled cables have more capacitance than straight cables. This additional capacitance helped tame the high end that Marshalls are notorious for. I didn't pick coily cables for the tone, though. Back then, I had no idea that the coiled cables would have any effect at all on my tone. It was just simply a happy accident. So earlier I mentioned that we would talk about my Fender head, which we saw in one of the photographs. That Fender head was a 1966 or 67 Fender Bassman. So back in the days of Cheater, I took that head to every single gig primarily as a backup. If something happened to the Marshall, I knew I could actually get a pretty good sound out of the Fender. So I did use that Fender head in sort of an unusual way in the last few months of Cheater. Now I had two Fender cabinets, and I still have one. Unfortunately, both the smaller cabinet and the head were stolen from me some years ago. But anyway, what I did was this. I'd set up the Fender stack and the Marshall stack on stage at the same time. The roadies didn't like it. Now with the Marshall, I could get that ferocious distortion sound, and I could dial a Fender in so I could get a really beautiful clean sound. But I didn't want them both going at the same time. So I took an old effects pedal and built what we now call an A-B switch. So what that AB switch would allow me to do is to switch which amplifier my guitar and my effects pedals were going to. So I could go from a rip-roaring distortion to this pristine, chimey, clean in an instant on the fly, mid-song even, and it was really cool. That was a pretty unusual thing back then. I thought I was pretty clever for coming up with the idea. Nowadays it's a very common thing. AB switches are super common. You can buy them online all day long. So there you have it, a complete rundown of all the gear I was using back in the cheater days. What did we cover? We covered the guitars, we covered the amps, we covered the pedals, we covered the lack of distortion pedals, we covered the cables, we covered my backup amp, we covered it all. So if you'd like to have an in-depth video on any of the individual guitars or on that amp, leave a comment down below. My telepathy is completely shot, so unless you leave a comment, I won't know what it is you guys would like to see. If you like what you saw in today's video or any of the other videos I've done, please subscribe. When you subscribe, you gotta hit the bell icon. You gotta hit the bell icon. If you don't hit the bell icon, you don't get notified. I don't understand why YouTube makes it difficult, but they do. Alright, that's all I got for you today. Until next time, live well, rock hard. I'm going to send you out on that board tape of Love Machine along with some vintage photos of Cheater. We were almost famous.